Alright, so in the last video, we talked about the shoulder girdle. Okay, that's the attachment of the upper extremity to the axial skeleton. Remember that this shoulder girdle is made up of two bones, the clavicle, the S-shaped clavicle, and the scapula, the flat, broad, blade-shaped bone. And the shoulder girdle is interesting because the bones of the upper extremity have an indirect connection to the axial skeleton, because recall that the humerus attaches and articulates with the lateral glenoid cavity of the scapula, but the scapula does not articulate with the axial skeleton. It's bridged by the clavicle, which articulates with the scapula laterally by way of the acromial end here to the acromion process. And then this bone, the clavicle, articulates with the axial skeleton at the sternal end. It articulates with the sternum, okay, the rib cage. So it's a sort of an indirect connection that lacks stability, it lacks strength and sturdiness, but what it lacks in sturdiness it makes up for, more than makes up for, in mobility and range of motion, which is a trade-off, but it works. Okay. Moving distally on the extremity. Okay. Still, it's the most proximal bone of the upper extremity. This is the radius. Okay. The radius has proximally this ball-shaped head, distally this widening into this sort of triangular shaped distal end with a few different articular surfaces for bones of the forearm. Okay, this is the upper arm's contribution to the elbow joint. Okay, looking at this humerus, I know this is a right-sided humerus, and I'm gonna, as I point out structures, I'm gonna tell you where on the bone they're located with directional terms, and it's gonna help you figure out that. It's a right-sided humerus. Okay, so this is the anterior. The best clue that I have is going to be this groove. Okay, where my pinky is here. It's called the intratubercular groove. Okay, it separates the greater and lesser tubercles of the humerus. Okay, the greater and lesser tubercles, are anterolateral structures they are attachment sites for muscle, and they're visually and grossly different in size. The lesser tubercle is more medial, it's here, okay, and the greater tubercle is lateral, and then there's a pretty distinct groove in between those. It's the intratubercular groove. The intratubercular groove is anterior, okay, and it's proximal. As well, if you can imagine this round articular surface here, the head of the humerus, if you can imagine that fitting into the scapula's glenoid cavity, then you can start to imagine how when you're looking from the front, this is a right-sided bone in the anatomic position, okay? So intratubercular groove, it's anterior and lateral, okay? The lesser tubercle more medial, the greater tubercle more lateral, and this is the proximal end, okay? The distal end is triangle shaped. It expands and it widens as you move distally on the bone. There are two flared out portions of this bone. There's one medial and one lateral. These structures are called epicondyles. Okay. Okay. There's a medial and a lateral. Okay, this is the medial epicondyle. This is the lateral condyle through here. Okay. And then as you notice, the most distal aspect of this bone has these smooth appearing, rounded appearing surfaces. Okay, these are areas of articulation for bones of the forearm. Okay, and they have names. The lateral ball-shaped smaller surface is known as the capitulum. Okay, the caput, or that word caput or cap, refers to that. It means head, and it is a site of articulation for a part of the forearm bone, the radius. The part of the radius known as the head of the radius articulates with the capitulum here on the lateral aspect of the humerus. Okay. The medial area of articulation here for the ulna is known as the trochlea. It's bow tie shaped. It's this area here. Okay, it's bow tie shaped, and it's medial, and it accommodates the medial ulna. Okay. I have a left humerus here, not a right, so you may use your imagination a bit, but this is the head of the radius, and it articulates with the capitulum of the humerus. Okay. In the anatomic position, the radius, as you're going to see, is going to be lateral, and it articulates with the lateral capitulum, and the ulna of the forearm is medial, and it articulates with the trochlea, the bow tie shaped, smooth joint surface. Okay. So just to review real quick, I'm looking at this list to make sure I didn't miss anything. Oh, I did actually miss one. Okay, here, somewhere just proximal to the midpoint of the humerus, in this anterior and lateral position, is a rough, small tuberosity here. It's called the deltoid tuberosity. It's a little difficult to see in this video, and it's subtle, but it's a site of attachment for a muscle called the deltoid, which is the round shoulder muscle that moves the arm in this direction, okay? And that is abduction, abduction. So that's going to be the deltoid tuberosity of the humerus. And there are a couple of structures known as the necks, okay? The necks of the humerus are the surgical neck and the anatomic neck. Okay. The surgical neck of the humerus is sort of what I have my fingers wrapped around here. Okay. It's distal to the tuberosities. It's distal to this intratubercular groove. It's called the surgical neck of the humerus. You can remember it because sometimes a surgeon is such a pain in the butt you just want to wring his neck, just like that. That's the surgical neck. The anatomic neck is the boundary between the articular head of the humerus and the tuberosities and the rest of the, the tubercles and the rest of the bone. Okay, so the anatomic neck of the humerus is here. It's sort of where I have my fingers wrapped around now. Or I could maybe do it this way to show you better. That's the anatomic neck. This is the surgical neck. Okay, a diagram in the book might show you a little better than I demonstrated just now, but that's how you tell the difference. Really, I imagine if this is the head of the humerus and this is this body, the neck is in between, and just imagine one wring the neck of a surgeon who's a real pain in the butt. Okay, that's the surgical neck. That's the structures of the humerus. Oh, there's a couple more, I'm so sorry. So if you look at the posterior part of this bone, you'll notice really quite a prominent fossa here. Remember, a fossa is a depression. Okay, a depression in the bone. And it's the olecranon fossa. It's the part of the posterior humerus that accommodates the olecranon process of the ulna. This is the elbow joint, okay? And when you elbow somebody, or you imagine the tip of your elbow, what you're feeling is your medial forearm bone, the ulna, and specifically this olecranon process. And I'll get more to the ulna in a second, but you can see how nicely those things fit together, and when the arm is straight, that olecranon fossa accommodates the C-shaped olecranon process, so that, you know, it really makes this nice fluid range of motion. Okay. When you look at the anterior surface of the humerus like we were before, and you put the ulna in its place, you'll notice that when you flex the arm, when you bend the elbow and move the hand up towards the shoulder. That's elbow flexion. This anterior aspect of the ulna, this part right here, which is called the coronoid process of the ulna, not to be confused with the coronoid process of the mandible. This is the coronoid process of the humerus, and it accommodates that tip of the coronoid process of the ulna. Okay, so this fossa in the distal, anterior, and medial aspect of the humerus, that's the coronoid fossa. It's a depression. It's a fossa. If this was made of silly putty and I went like that, pushed it in with my finger, it would leave a depression. That's a fossa. Okay, it's the coronoid fossa. Coronoid and olecranon fossa, trochlea, capitulum, medial and lateral epicondyles, deltoid tuberosity, lesser and greater tubercles, intertubercular groove, head of the humerus, surgical neck, anatomic neck. That's the humerus, okay? Moving on to the bones of the forearm. I've told you a little bit about these, but let me start with the medial ulna, okay? And again, I'm going to remind you that I don't have a right-sided radius, so I'm going to ask you to use your imagination a little bit, but I'm going to point out the structures to you, and I'm going to help you understand why that's a left-sided radius and not a right. Okay, this is a right humerus, or no, right ulna, okay? The ulna is the medial of two forearm bones, okay? Again, I'm telling you this is a left-sided radius, but the radius is going to be lateral in the forearm, and the ulna is going to be medial, okay? And the ulna is very distinct, okay? The ulna has this C-shaped fossa here, where the humerus fits into it. This C-shaped fossa in this bone, where the humerus fits in, is called the olecranon fossa, okay? And it's an anterior structure. And when you look at the bone from the front, it's like you're looking into a C-shaped fossa, okay? As you hold in your hand like this, your thumb, the more distal process is called the coronoid process, and it goes into the coronoid fossa of the humerus when they're joined together, okay? The posterior or more proximal projection, if you're holding it like this, it's your pointer through pinky fingers. It's this part here. This is the olecranon process. It fits into the humerus like this, and it fits into the olecranon fossa of the humerus like this. And when you elbow somebody in the face in a bar fight, it is your ulna that you're hitting him with. It's the olecranon process, most likely, that you're hitting him with when you elbow in the face in a bar fight, okay? That's the proximal part of the ulna, okay? Also, as you're holding this bone, and I'm going to point out the same thing on the radius, as you're holding this bone anteriorly, you're going to notice that the lateral surface of it, that is the surface that faces the radius, has kind of a sharper edge. This medial edge is quite round, but there's a little bit of a sharp edge on the medial portion here. This is the anatomic position. So the bone is medial in the forearm, but it has a medial and a lateral side, of course. The lateral side has a sharp edge, which you'll be able to feel when you hold this in lab, okay? It's a helpful landmark. When you look into the olecranon fossa, I'm sorry, I've been calling this the olecranon fossa, and that's not right. The olecranon fossa is a part of the humerus, I'm sorry. But when you look into this, C-shaped structure of the ulna, you're looking anteriorly, and you'll notice that lateral aspect of it has a sharp edge, okay? Distally on the ulna, you're gonna see a little quill shape or stylus shaped projection off this bone. Okay, it's a process, it's called a styloid process. Both the radius and the ulna have a styloid process, and the styloid process of the ulna is found medially Okay, and it's very distinct. And again, you're going to see when you look in lab, but that pointy quill-shaped, stylus-shaped structure that looks like you could just dip this in ink and write with it, that's the styloid process of the ulna. Okay, and in the anatomic position, the right ulna styloid process is medial and distal. Okay. Let's think about the other bone of the forearm, the radius. The radius is more, a little more substantial. Okay, it's shorter, slightly, and its distal part is more flared out and more substantial and larger. Okay. The proximal aspect of this bone is very distinct as compared to the ulna. Okay. If you remember the restaurant on the top of Crown Center, the American restaurant, it's like a short cylinder. Okay, it's very round, very flat top. That's what this part of the bone reminds me of. This is the head of the radius. The head of the radius looks to me like like a short stack of poker chips, or the American restaurant on top of Crown Center, that rotating restaurant. And it is the dead giveaway that you're looking at the proximal part of the bone. Okay, this is the part of the bone that articulates with the capitulum of the humerus. In the anatomic position, the radius is always lateral. It's always on the thumb side of the forearm. Okay, so in my forearm, in the anatomic position, the radius is always going to be on the thumb side, okay, on the lateral side. Okay. On my other arm, the radius is on the thumb side. No, that's not a great view, but I think you can understand what I'm saying. In the anatomic position, you'll notice that the distal end of this radius also flares out, and it also has a stylus-shaped or quill-shaped projection. This is the styloid process of the radius. Okay, so remember I told you that both the radius and the ulna have a styloid process. This is the styloid process of the radius, and it's distal and it's lateral. Okay. Finally, the last thing that you need to note about this left radius is that you could imagine that the styloid process of this radius is distal and lateral if you're holding it like this, and you'd say, okay, fine, it's distal and it's lateral. But the last main clue to help you know that this is a left is by remembering what we call the radial tuberosity. The radial tuberosity of the radius is anterior and it's proximal. It's this bump or this rough patch. It's proximal, it's interior, and it's slightly medial. And you'll notice that if all of that is true, and this is anterior and medial and proximal, and the styloid process is distal and lateral, you're going to notice that the same thing I said before. The part of this bone that faces the ulna, okay, it's the medial aspect of the radius. It's got kind of a sharper edge. The lateral aspect of it is nice and round. It's a mirror image. This part of it is a mirror image of the ulna. Okay, the left ulna lateral aspect is going to have this kind of sharpened edge. That sharpened edge on these two bones is the attachment site for a membrane called the intraosseous membrane. Remember that osseous is bone and intra means between. So if you use your imagination and pretend that these are both right or both left, there's a flat membrane or film that attaches to those sharp edges of those bones. It's called the intraosseous membrane. Okay, and that's why I tell you that this is a left-sided humerus, not a right-sided humerus. Okay, so just to review, most proximally you have the head of the radius. Okay, very distinct. It's round. It's very flat at the top. It's the head of the radius, and just distal to it but still in the proximal part of the bone, is this rough bump. It's the radial tuberosity. This is the attachment side of the biceps brachii tendon. Okay, the biceps attaches to here, and it pulls on the bone, and it assists in flexion at the elbow. Okay, it's the muscle and the movement that you use for a bicep curl in the gym. Okay, that's the radial tuberosity, and this is the distal end of the radius. Laterally, you got the styloid process of the radius. I think that's it. There's a part of the bone here on the distal and medial aspect of the bone called the ulnar notch. That's on our list as well. And I've got two bones of the same side, I'll point it out to you in the lab, but that's going to be the ulnar notch. It accommodates the distal end of the ulna, which runs to the medial aspect of the forearm. This is the lateral aspect of the forearm. Okay, it's the radius. So that's the arm. Okay, I'm going to stop this video here. That's going to be from the shoulder girdle to the carpal region, the wrist. Okay, next video is going to be talking about the bones of the wrist, which are fairly complicated, and then the phalanges, the bones of the digits or the fingers, which are not as complicated. Okay.